My name is Lori. Welcome to my YouTube channel. We are quilters. Today we are going to travel back in time. We are going to trim this quilt and use continuous binding, a trick I learned from another YouTuber. I will give her credit when we get to that point. And we are going to machine bind it, including mitered corners. So now that we're ready to get back to work and this big job of binding, let's go. Before you can bind a quilt, you have to take it off the machine. The bottom rail is pinned on. The top rail is basted onto a muslin header. Here I use the rotary cutter and just nick at a stitch and pull. Here it is, all ready to be trimmed. I like to leave nice wide edges on each side so that there is never a shortness of batting or backing. Here's where I'm going to say, oopsie, I didn't record me trimming that big quilt, but I will show you the little quilt as I trimmed it. So I lay it on the counter, big cutting mat, big ruler. I lay the ruler down, make sure you hold onto it carefully, trim it away, and there's the piece laying. And as you pull it away, I think this is the biggest ta-da moment in quilting, when you trim away the extra stuff. Here it is, all trimmed up. Here we are back to the big quilt example. It's hanging up, it's ready to go. I pulled some different bindings, and here is the one that I picked to make the pinks pop. Of course, before you put the binding on, you have to figure out how much binding to cut. So I needed 250 inches of binding divided by 40-inch strips. I needed 7 strips to go around this quilt. So here I am joining them on a nice mitered corner. I left a little bit of an overhang so that I could trim away the salvage edges. Here is the pile of binding, 250 plus inches. I always like to lay it out and make sure that I've got the edges even before I start to iron. I trim away the extra triangles to about 1/4 inch, and then I iron. I happen to have some cardboard forms, and I just wrapped the binding around. I set my stitch length to the largest stitch length. I find myself some thread, and miraculously I actually have a spool of thread that matches. When I start binding, I want to leave a 10 to 12 inch tail hanging loose on the binding as I go so that I can make my continuous binding later. So I put it on there about 1/3 to halfway down one side, and I start binding and binding. I am not a pinner or a clipper. You can pin or clip if you want. I do a lot of fluffing and straightening and fluffing and straightening because I don't have a very big area off to the left of my machine, but it works for me, and it's okay. It just takes time. I do about 6 inches at a time, fluff, straighten, and it works. We're coming up on a corner. So to the corner, and then when you get about 1/4 inch away from that corner, sew right off. And then you are going to fold and flip up the fabric at a 45-degree angle and flip it straight down and start sewing right at the corner and go, go, go. It will turn out to be a beautiful mitered corner. We're almost to the most exciting part. I saw this on my sewing room with Beth. She showed how to do this continuous binding. So I have my tail and I pinned it up there so it's out of the way. And I put another pin in about 4 inches above that. I'm going to continue binding until I get to that pin. So I'll have 12 to 15 inches of loose tail at both ends when I am done trimming to make the continuous binding. When I get to the pin, I'm going to put in a little bit of a back stitch. I remove the quilt from the machine, pull it out, cut my threads, because now comes the miracle part of making the continuous binding. This is not hard, and once you've done it, you will never forget. So I pull and fluff my quilt up there so it's where we can see it. I lay the bindings on top of each other. I fold one back, and I use that pin that I was holding it up there with. Pull it out. I trim the bottom layer of binding off even where I have it folded. Boop, little scrap piece. Now I'm going to use that little piece here in a moment because I could measure, but this does it for me. So that scrap piece is 2.5 inches wide because I cut 2.5 inch binding. So I'm going to lay that there so it matches with the fold. And then I'm cutting my top layer of binding off at 2.5 inches. There it is. And it is the right length. Oh, it's a miracle. It's the right length so that now I can join them on the diagonal, just like I did when I was sewing those pieces together, except this time I'm not leaving that sloppy overhang like I did before. I am pinning because I hate wrestling with these two pieces of fabric, and never fail, one of them gets twisted and turned, and then I have to pick it out. So I am pinning in two places. I am not messing around. So I'm going to sew across the diagonal, and we will have continuous binding. So because I had left so much tail on both pieces of binding, this is easier. If you let a shorter tail, it is more difficult to line it up. So I have my piece of tape down there. I am not a marker. You can mark this if you want. No big deal. And I'm sewing across the diagonal and removing my pins as I go. And this is so wonderful. Because before the directions were too difficult and it gave me a headache even thinking about it. So I trim my threads, and like Beth does at my sewing room, she always checks before she trims, which I think that's a pretty smart idea. And then you lay it on there, and you are ready to finish the binding. The binding is on the quilt. You should be so happy, ready for a little celebration and a break and a snack. Now that you've taken a break, it is time to start machine binding. Flip that quilt over, turn over the edge. I start somewhere in the middle and just work my way around. I am not a pinner or a clipper, as you know, and so I work in about 6-inch increments. I fluff the quilt, straighten it out, sew along the edge of the binding, and as long as you take your time, you don't need to pin or clip unless you really want to. And if you do, that's okay too. In retrospect, I should have added an extra 1.5 inch strip on the outside. I'm losing my points, but my daughter-in-law won't even care. So it'll be all right. We're coming up on another corner. So I trim the thread. I clip the bulk out of the corner, not cutting through the threads, just a little tiny nip. And then I turn my pieces over to the front, kind of straighten them out, make that 45-degree angle, kind of mush it with my fingers, give it a hint of where it's going to be. And then I get out my stiletto, because that comes in handy. You can use a pin if you don't have a stiletto, but that will work, whatever you need to do. I don't like to get my fingers in there, and a pin, if you actually pin it makes it bubble up, so it makes it difficult. So I hold it the way I want it to go until I get on the bed of the machine. And you notice I'm taking extra time here so that it doesn't come undone. Then I get my stiletto out and I hold it. I take my time getting it positioned where I want it, and I hold it until I get the front edge of the binding under, and then I do one hand crank of the wheel and needle down so that I can turn it, and it will be perfect and wonderful. So then I just kind of turn it and I keep right on going down the next side. I'll show you a close-up here of that beautiful miter in just a moment. See, there it is. Perfect. Not a problem. Let's get it done, shall we? In the next episode, we will talk about hand binding these little cuties. Please like and subscribe to help me grow my channel. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate your support.